Alright, tube, so we are back, of course, to talk about some Final Fantasy VII Remake. And what we have today is a video I want to make a couple days back whenever the Reddit post that we're going to look at was new at the time. But we did some other videos that I felt like were more important, and this is kind of a discussion that we could have at really any point. So what we have today is pretty interesting in my opinion. We had somebody over on Reddit look at the original walkthrough guide for Final Fantasy VII and kind of judge the length of the Midgar segment and kind of compare it to the rest of the game. So how many pages the Midgar segment took up versus how many pages the rest of the game takes up. And the point of doing this, of course, is to kind of get a baseline and a possible idea of how they could handle the remake sequels. It took a chunk of the FF7 story, just the Midgar segment, and turned it into one entire game. So I personally thought this was a really interesting concept. I wanted to look at the walkthrough myself just to kind of reference what he's talking about. So I wanted to look up like a PDF file or a scan of the walkthrough guide. And the problem that I personally run into is that the guide that I was able to track down is different from the one that he's referencing. And why I say that is because he talks about sections of the game, like how many pages they are and, you know, what pages they start on and end on. And the walkthrough guide that I have to reference anyways is different from that. By the way, I've said he a few times. I have no idea what their gender is. By the way, they say that the Midgar segment in their guide is 42 pages, page 26 to 68. Whereas with the guide that I have, the Midgar segment starts on page 52 and ends on 89 and partially on page 90, which equals 37 to 38 pages. So about a 5-page difference there. And the other example they give is from Calm to City of the Ancients for them is 57 pages, page 69 to page 126. Whereas with my guide, it's 62 pages, page 90 all the way up to page 152. So oddly enough, another 5-page difference, but because my Midgar segment is 5 pages less, but the Calm to City of the Ancients segment is 5 pages more, it still ends up equaling out. From Mock Reactor 1 to the end of the City of the Ancients in both these guides, it's still 99 pages in total. So it seems like we have different guides, and I think mine would be like a newer version at some point down the road. I don't know exactly when. Just because my Midgar segment starts much later than theirs does in their guide. So I feel like that'd be a re-release thing where they're like, we're going to re-release the guide again, but here's even more content than we initially had. Or maybe theirs is a newer version that's like more curated, cut out like the bloat of the bullshit that you don't need within the guide. Maybe that's why theirs starts earlier. I don't know. Anyways, kind of the overall point of this Reddit post was to point out that a lot of people think that the Midgar segment being its own game was kind of ridiculous, right? It's like it's one little small section at the beginning of the game. They made it into its full game. How dare they? How can they do that? But when you actually reference like walkthrough guides and stuff, you realize that the Midgar segment is actually quite big. Again, using their guide as a reference really quickly, there's only a 15-page difference between the entirety of the Midgar segment and then from Calm all the way to the end of Disc 1. Because what a lot of people fail to realize is even though we still have the rest of the world of Gaia and the rest of the Final Fantasy VII story to do with the remake games, once you get outside of Midgar in the original game, a lot of places you go to don't offer a lot of, like, story detail, right? They're pass-through points, as the Reddit poster mentions. But as they're also going to point out that most of the places you go to outside of Midgar, a lot of times only take up, like, 1 to 2 pages at a time. So you could make the comparison that Midgar, yes, there's a lot of story there, a lot of backstory, a lot of character progression and things like that. Still, Midgar is one location. One location that within a guide takes up, like, 40-something pages versus most of the other locations around the world of Gaia taking up, like, 1 page. So again, if we're just using the original game as a comparison, there's a good chance that Part 2, if they're following kind of what we're seeing with these guides, that we could go pretty far into the world of Gaia and into the FF7 story. Now, they're talking, like this person on Reddit, you know, they're talking about Calm all the way to the City of the Ancients, the Forgotten Capital. I'm still not sure if I think that we're going to have that much content in Part 2. Obviously, I'd love it, and I do think it is a fantastic, like, cliffhanger ending point, assuming that the same thing happens in both games. And obviously, this is going to come down to how are they going to handle it. Is it going to be similar to the original FF7? Are a lot of these locations we go to just kind of stopping off points? We get a bit of story, a bit of lore, and then we move forward? Or are we going to have a lot of these locations like have dedicated chapters, assuming that there's even going to be chapters in Part 2 as well? Like right now, you're seeing gameplay of the Chocobo Farm in the background. Like, is that going to be its own dedicated location? Would it even have its own dedicated chapter and story and lore and side quests and stuff? Or is it just a location that you can visit, entirely optional, and maybe you could go from Calm straight to the Mithril Mines? You don't even have to come here, potentially. Obviously, coming here can be beneficial in the original game if you don't know how to deal with the Midgarzal. Maybe you're underleveled, don't know how to fight them, just want to bypass them entirely, but it is still an optional location in the original game. And even other places like Gungaga and Fort Condor, they're almost entirely optional locations in the original game. You do come to them at certain points throughout the story, but you don't have to go to them when you first come across them if you don't want to. So again, almost entirely optional. But would they be mandatory and have their own chapters and dedicated stories and stuff and side quests when it comes to Remake? Like, that's, again, it's a question we just don't really have the answer for. Now, me personally, and of course these are just my thoughts on the topic, I don't think we're going to go all the way up to the City of the Ancients, the Forgotten Capital. There's just, from Calm to there is like 17 or 18 named locations. You got to assume that they're going to expand every single location, right? Maybe not every location is going to have its own like dedicated chapter or story, but they're still going to be a lot bigger, like 3D and explorable, like kind of like how Remake Part 1 is with the sectors, right? They also have to factor in stuff like, there's Cosmo Canyon, but there's also the Cave of Gi within Cosmo Canyon. Like, those two within Remake could be entirely different chapters. So one location technically could offer like 2 or more chapters of content. Another example of this that I can give is Junon, right? We have the Under of Junon that we go to first, and then we eventually work our way up to the actual proper city or town of Junon, whatever you want to call it. That's probably going to be its own chapter or 2, depending on how they want to spread it out and how big Junon is to explore and things. And then, of course, we have the cargo ship, which I can almost guarantee is going to have its own dedicated chapter. It has its own little unique story that takes place on the cargo ship. And, of course, with the original game, this is our first visual of Sephiroth. We fight Genova, of course, though. And then, of course, once we get to Costa del Sol, that'll either be its own dedicated chapter or at least the start of a new chapter once we step off the cargo ship. So you're looking at from Junon to Costa del Sol, like 3 chapters minimum. Again, this is just pure speculation, just my thoughts on the subject. I just find it hard to believe that we're going to go all the way from Calm to the Forgotten Capital with how much they're probably going to be expanding a lot of these locations. And then you got to factor in, that I haven't even said yet, the brand new stuff. Like, there's entire chapters of content in Remake Part 1 that did not even exist at all when it came to the original game. That's obviously going to be the same thing in Part 2. There's just going to be brand new shit that did not exist before. And then even beyond that, there's people out there that seem to think, and I don't know how they come to this conclusion, that Part 2 is going to go all the way up to the Northern Cave, which is kind of ridiculous in my opinion, because then you got to factor in places even beyond the Forgotten Capital, like Coral Valley Cave. You got to factor in Icicle Inn, the Great Glacier, the Gaia Cliffs, or however you pronounce that word. And then, of course, into the Whirlwind Maze, and then the reveal of Sephiroth within the North Crater, the actual Sephiroth. And there's just so much content from Calm until now that I don't see that being all within Part 2. It just seems unreasonable. Now, what we've discussed here on the channel quite a bit is the idea of Part 2 ending in Niebelheim. I think it makes a lot of sense. Some people seem to think it doesn't because in the original game, there wasn't a whole lot of dialogue there. You kind of just pass through and go on to Mount Nibel. But again, that doesn't matter because they're going to expand it. Obviously, it's our first visit to Niebelheim, and given with Remake, the knowledge of past, present, future, we're probably going to have a run-in with Sephiroth there, and maybe even another boss fight with him or something. You can't really base how locations are going to go in Remake versus how they were handled in the original game. Like, nobody would have predicted goddamn final chapter of Remake Part 1. Nobody would have seen that coming, right? So you don't know how they're going to handle this shit when it comes to Part 2. Also think it makes a lot of sense, as I've said in the past, most people seem to think that Part 2 is going to open up with a Calm flashback, where we look back at the events that happened with the Niebelheim incident. It only makes sense that Part 2 would end at Niebelheim as well. And something that I thought would be kind of interesting to do is with the guide that I'm looking at, the Midgar segment is like 37 to 38 pages. So I figured, what if we add that amount of pages from the Calm section of my guide and see where it ends at? Just so happens to end in Niebelheim. So of course, with the guide that I'm using for reference, the Calm segment starts on page 90. So if we add, 37 or 38 pages, that puts us on page 127 or 128. Either way, that puts us right smack dab in the Shinra Mansion. And I just thought that was a hell of a coincidence, man. We talk about Part 2 ending in Niebelheim all the time. And it just so happens with the guide that I'm looking at that the Midgar segment and Calm to Niebelheim take up the exact same amount of pages. I feel like it's written in the stars, my dudes. Now, of course, using a strategy guide, a walkthrough guide for the original Final Fantasy VII on PlayStation 1 20-something years ago isn't exactly comparable to how they're going to handle Remake, but it is an interesting observation and discussion to have because I think it does give us a bit of a baseline idea of how they might handle it. And actually, something I forgot to mention a little bit earlier in their video is that the Reddit OP mentions how people might point out how they expanded the sewers and the train graveyard with Remake and how they were kind of nothing when it came to the original game. But again, trying to push like how much the pages matter with these guides. Again, I don't think the pages matter, and I do think them expanding these locations do. Like the train graveyard in the original FF7 had absolutely zero dialogue. There was not a single line spoken between any of the characters in the original FF7 in the train graveyard. Yet when we get to Remake, that's its own entire fucking chapter. They expanded the shit out of that, and they're probably going to do that to a lot of other locations. And the same thing with the sewer where we fight Abzu in the original FF7. Like, that had a little bit of dialogue, and then we fight Abzu, and then we get out. It's like 2 areas. It's its own entire chapter when it comes to Remake. So all its like insignificant locations in the original FF7, even if they might just be 1 page in a guide, could be their own entire chapter. That's why I'm kind of lowballing it with Niebelheim, right? Based on the original game, Calm to Niebelheim's only like 12 or 13 named locations. Each of those locations, if they want them to be, can be their own dedicated chapters, and that leaves them room to add in additional content if they want to shoot for the like 18 chapter mark like they did with the first game. Anyways, videos, I'm starting to lose my voice. This video is taking a lot longer to record than I planned, and the video itself is longer than I wanted it to be. But again, I thought it was a very interesting conversation. So, of course, I want to pass off to you guys. After what we've talked about within this video, using OG guides for FF7, how far do you think we're going to get into Gaia and the story of FF7? Like, how far do you think we're going to get to? Niebelheim, Forgotten Capital, maybe even the Northern Crater, Northern Cave, whatever the fuck it's called. Either way, videos, that is the video. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, give it a thumbs up. Subscribe to the channel if you guys are new. Once updated more Final Fantasy VII Remake content. Turn on notifications. Follow me on Twitter, dashingdavidYT. I'm my Discord. Links to my social networks are in the description and in the outro. Later, guys.
Used to care what people thought, but now I care more, and nobody out here's got it figured out. So therefore, I've lost all hope of a happy ending, depending on whether or not it's worth it. So insecure, no one's perfect. We spend it with no shame. We blow that like Coltrane. We in here like Low Gain or leave it like Obang.